Hi guys, thanks for getting together. A quick Monday update, 10th of January on the issues throughout Asia Pacific, Europe, Middle East and Africa. I might kick off, chaps, ignoring the craziness of what was a rather busy weekend for myself and the guys working. Today in East Asia Pacific, as well as the Myanmar Daily, which is of course a challenge in itself at the moment, we've covered off on one assessment and 28 other developments, mainly ignoring COVID. I'll just give a quick overview of some of those issues. The issue that we assessed today was the curfew in PNG over security concerns in Alatal. Authorities imposed the curfew from midnight to 5 a.m. over concerns of violence. This comes, of course, after the arrest, or beg your pardon, the killing of Tommy Baker, who was a prominent criminal and indeed a very famous escapee. Now, there's a lot more behind this than meets the eyes, which I shall allude to, but at the national level, we have an election coming up this year in Papua New Guinea. And of course, we've got the disposed Prime Minister O'Neill and the incumbent Marape, and that is a battle that makes Tyson and Fury look like a picnic. So these issues are all related through the tribalism. Sitting behind that, of course, you've got the resource interests of the West and of China. So for those clients that want more information on that, I'd suggest we have a telephone conversation about it, because it is potentially going down a bad path in PNG, and there's a lot of impacts on those with significant investments in that country, particularly depending on which West or China side they are aligned to and how that unfolds. In a couple of other issues for East Asia Pacific, the Philippines, the Manila International Airport Authority yesterday cancelled 104 flights from the international airport in Manila, and that is basically because of the lack of staff available for COVID. And also in the Philippines, 150-day nationwide gun ban was enforced yesterday in preparation for the upcoming national elections. Meanwhile, in Thailand, authorities said that the provinces of Sitati, which is the gateway to the large islands east of the peninsula, not in eastern Thailand, but east of the Malay Peninsula, gateway to Koh Samui and islands surrounding that area, and Krabi, which is north of Phuket on the other side of the peninsula, and Phang Na, which is back towards the Sitati. I beg your pardon, it's further south near Phuket. They'll accept foreign tourists under the sandbox scheme as of tomorrow. Now, previously, that sandbox scheme has been muted to be rolled out in Chiang Mai, Hua Hin and other places, but now it's only going to be extended from Phuket to these other locations. So Thailand's loosening up because it needs the revenues. Other countries are tightening up because the realities of COVID are hitting them. Also in Thailand, over 200 Myanmarese residents fled to the Thai border in Mae Hong Son, Muang, over concern of renewed fighting. Well, let me just put it bluntly, because of fighting between various forces in Myanmar. If you want more information on that, again, contact us separately. In Timor-Leste, officials from the Ministry of Health called on communities to maintain cleanliness following a surge of dengue cases in the last few weeks. And this is kind of interesting, given that the dengue is a public health consideration caused by still water and allowing a specific type of mosquito to breed. So asking people to wash their hands and wipe their bottoms is going to assist. So again, it's highlighting some lack of government maturity there. In Vietnam, the Immigration Department said the automatic extension of visas for foreigners in Vietnam stuck due to COVID-19, and that will be basically stopped on January the 15th. So foreigners are advised to review their visa status and look to exit the country to avoid overstaying, or to assess how they can look to renew a work visa or whatever type of visa they're on. In Australia, asymptomatic workers from essential supply chain industries who are close contacts for COVID-19 will no longer be required to self-isolate. That was stated by the Prime Minister Scott Morrison today. And in wonderful Australian contradiction, public transport services in New South Wales will run on a weekend timetable starting today. This is due to staff shortages from COVID-19 measures. So again, it highlights the overrated nature of Australia in terms of governance on the international scheme, where the national level and the state level are excessive, and there's not a unity there, and most decisions are being made based on political popularity for bureaucrats and politicians. In Queensland, there's major flooding, particularly to note the Bruce Highway, which is the major highway heading north along the Queensland coast, remembering that's we're talking probably a 2,500 kilometre coastline where the Bruce Highway runs, and that affects various investments and clients up in particularly in the Mackay region, the gas region. Finally, also in Papua New Guinea, teachers from various regions gathered outside the Education Department headquarters in Port Moresby yesterday to inquire about their entitlements. Again, it raises questions about governance, where the governments are taking massive cash donations from countries such as Australia and then distributing it to political cronies. And getting back to the Education Department, their complaints include unpaid salaries, allowances, benefits and leave fares. Meanwhile, high-ranking politicians and members of the ministries appear to have an inordinate amount of wealth. I think they're the key issues I want to cover off on East Asia Pacific. So, Bhargav, over to whoever's next upon the sub-region agendas.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, before I begin South Asia, I must ask and deal with the elephant in the room, or mainly because you spoke about Australia at length. What is your take on the current controversy related to Novak Djokovic?
Again, Australian absurdity, arrogance, self-righteousness, a national embarrassment, various departments that can't and won't communicate with each other. How do you end up with the number one tennis player in the world arriving under the belief that he's going to be able to defend a tennis championship and then have it bogged down in courts, state that he filled in the wrong form, have to wait until the number one tennis player in the world arrives to defend a title, the Australian Open, which is one of the Grand Slams, and you haven't managed to tell him he's filled in the wrong form? It is typical of a government that is overpaid, under-accountable, passes off all of the impact of its incompetent decisions to businesses to pull them out or to dig up resources to buck past their lack of competency to future generations to deal with. In summary, national embarrassment highlights incompetency and arrogance. And we wonder why we upset China whilst we go out of our way to sell them iron ore and coal. It's ludicrous, Bhargav. Enough said on that one, I think.
Thank you, Paul. Moving over to South Asia, there are 16 other developments and one assessed issue, and that happens to be the planned protests in the upcoming days in Pakistan. What actually is stoking tensions this time around is the Local Government Act 2021 being introduced in the Sindh province. The government there is led by the party which is actually in power at the federal level, that is Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf of Imran Khan, Prime Minister Imran Khan, and in alliance with them is Muttahida Qawmi Movement, MQMP Pakistan, which is a smaller faction of the bigger controversial United MQM of Altaf Hussain. Now, we need to note here that they have announced protests across all districts in Sindh province, which is likely to have an impact on businesses which have widespread operations in the Sindh province. And more importantly, such protests are likely to hit the smaller businesses harder than those of international multinational firms which have the financial backing to cushion out any such impact. Now, Having said that, Pakistan in itself has a very complicated governance structure. There was minimal reform after the independence in 1947. Businesses need to understand that while dealing with the governance structures within the country. At the same time, in other countries in South Asia, primary issue which keep popping out, especially in recent times, is the rapid increase in cases, COVID-19 cases, primarily in India. We have seen restrictions going up in Delhi, Mumbai, and in Bangalore. They've already imposed lockdowns and curfews in the evenings and in the weekends. We need to see how fast the government can actually control the situation this time around. Interestingly, the deaths have been controlled, but the number of positive cases haven't been controlled yet. Before I pass on the baton to Bassel, I must round off with Central Asian issues, mainly in Kazakhstan. The protests and the police action last week basically reiterates that in the Russian sphere of influence, there's nobody other than Russia who can actually control things. It is very unlike of our national leader to invite an external force to control a mob within his own country. I mean, it is very unlikely. It can only happen in a place like Kazakhstan, which is still under the influence of Russia and Russia's counterpart for NATO, that is Collective Security Treaty Organization. And we have seen the protests calm down a little. It's been stifled, it's been controlled to a greater extent, but the authorities are calling the protesters armed terrorists with support from across the border in Kyrgyzstan and rest of other countries who have vested interests in the country. It is interesting to note that most of the protests have come from resource-rich region of Kazakhstan, that is the Western Kazakhstan, Margenthau province within Kazakhstan. So I must further reiterate that while dealing with Central Asian countries, the government and Russian influence is a common denominator across Central Asian countries, whether it's Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, or Kazakhstan, the biggest of them all. With that, I will pass it on to Bassel.
Thank you, Bhargav. So in the EMEA region today, we have more than 34 developments. Starting off with Iraq, it seems that U.S. logistics convoys are being targeted again. At least 3 U.S. Convoys were targeted by improvised explosive devices across Iraq yesterday in the Dahikar province, Al-Muthanna province, and in Baghdad province. If we head over to Syria, several civilians were injured after the Syrian Democratic Forces opened fire at a protest in Al-Suwaida town of Raqqa province. Also, 1 person was killed and several others were injured in clashes between brigades of the Turkish-backed militias yesterday. Also in Syria, an Islamic State leader was arrested by special units of the US-led coalition in the Hasaka province. In Turkey, especially the border area between Syria and Turkey, the unrest continues. At least 3 soldiers were killed by the Kurdistan Workers' Party PKK terrorists at the Akkale border area with Syria, and that was on January 8th. If we head over in Yemen, the Yemeni government forces recaptured substantial territory from the Houthi rebels in Al-Baida and Shabwa province on January 8th. They took over the Nu'man districts and the Al-Bahyan district in Shabwa. Over to you, Sitati, to cover Africa.
Thank you, Bassel. In today's roundup, we covered about 13 developments and 1 assessed issue across Africa. The ongoing anti-military protests featured as one of the 2 major assessments in the EMEA region. At least 1 protester was killed yesterday by security forces in the capital, Khartoum. Protests are likely to continue over the coming days, especially if the military does not pave the way for civilian rule. Down across in South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa has extended the deployment of about 2,700 National Defense Forces troops on the country's streets until March this year. The soldiers are expected to improve the security situation following recent attacks on government buildings, such as the Constitutional Court. And in Guinea, in West Africa, security forces clashed with protesters at the Lambani roundabout in Conakry on January 8th. The protesters demonstrated against the sale of a public youth facility for a private investor. Over to you, Chudi.
Thank you, Sitati. Now on the final round on news development in Europe. Health authorities in France suspended the required PCR test after the antigen test is confirmed as a confirmation for COVID-19 diagnosis yesterday. COVID-19 booster shots will be required to travel within the European Union starting from February the 1st. Booster shots should be received at most 9 months after your second vaccination or only dose in case of Johnson & Johnson vaccine. In Germany, authorities tightened the COVID-19 restrictions for restaurants, bars, and cafes yesterday, and also authorities added 39 countries to its highest risk travel list yesterday. In Spain, Catalonian authorities have approved the extension of COVID-19 restrictions across 132 municipalities till January 20th. To non-COVID news in Europe, in United Kingdom, around 100 vehicles in a convoy were involved in a Go Slow protest along the M60 highway yesterday. The demonstration was against the Greater Manchester Clean Air Zone Plan. The Clean Air Zone Plan will include a charge for passing vehicles along the way. Back to France, the National Society of French Railways will cut 10% of its high-speed trains and 20% of all the main lines to curb the spread of COVID-19. According to company officials, travelers whose trains are cancelled will be contacted with the company to change their tickets or be reimbursed. 8 departments in North and Southwest France declared orange alert for heavy rains and floods yesterday. According to departments, the weather conditions are expected to worsen tonight. Affected departments include Lens and Pyrénées-Atlantiques and Hautes-Pyrénées. And then finally, in Romania, there was a protest organized by transport workers against negotiations against unpaid salaries dating back to December the 19th. Expect a few transport delays around Sofia and all the cities around the country, excuse me. And that does it for the roundup in Europe.
Thank you, Chudi. Paul, with that, can we call it a day, unless you have any further points to add?
No, please go ahead and we'll issue that. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul.